Although assurances that Yamato Damashi would triumph in the end continued sounding, many pilots, by now often barely trained, appeared to believe it no more than that their sacrifice would help alter the course of the war. Too bright and sceptical to swallow the promises or to respond to military fanfares, they'd pleaded for their opportunity to die because their objective was as much gesture as military tactic, like much of Japanese thinking as a whole. It was as important, perhaps more important, to express utter sincerity in a just cause, no matter how hopeless, or precisely because it was hopeless, as to damage the enemy's gargantuan navy. Tale after folk tale about young heroes dying for doomed causes had taught that life's meaning couldn't be realized by calculating military advantage any more than by anything else attainable through mere reason. The ultimate goal was higher, purer. The last letters also reflected a fervent desire to surmount petty earthly interests. Attaining the longed-for spiritual victory over material comforts probably accounted for much of the young men's joy on the eve of their final flights. Such victory often required a Zen-like suppression of reason and personal feelings, a blind devotion to direct action, and an infinite capacity for hardship and pain. Takajiro Onishi called the lucky men already gods without earthly desires. Many penned their letters in eager anticipation for their splendid death, as sudden and clean as the shattering of crystal. With no remorse whatever, they truly never felt better. Looming military defeat increased the appeal of a death that demonstrated denial of self-interest and even community advantage. Belief counted more than reason, the purity of the motive more than the result. The ability to defy rationality and logic was itself a triumph, which was surely why many young pilots felt disgust and disgrace when they crashed without dying, and why others were plunged into depression when their missions were aborted. In their own words, they felt deprived of death. The disappointment of one group that returned to its base alive because bad weather near Okinawa had concealed the targeted ships became acute when it learned another had nevertheless pursued the attack that day, its pilots accomplishing nothing apart from their sublimely noble deaths. Many kamikaze pilots, even knowing they couldn't seriously damage the American fleet, hoped their demonstration of sublime dedication might shock the spiritually inferior enemy into defeat. Actually, however, it prompted the reverse reaction, reinforcing Americans' conviction that the demented Japanese had to be prostrated utterly. In the end, the supreme self-sacrifice of the kamikaze missions was also an expression of supreme selfishness. Yes, the pilots achieved their self-denying feats by heroically suppressing their own feelings, but they also ignored or discounted the feelings of others. To hell with the larger consequences of proving their utter purity, such as their enemies' frightened loathing of Japan. Even if the men of the 10th Army and 5th Fleet had known that what attracted many kamikazes was less killing others than dying well themselves, precious few would have been interested. So much stark evidence of degenerate thirst for blood at such inhuman cost nipped any desire, slight to begin with among most Americans, to probe deeper into the unfathomable Asian mentality. The cost-ineffectiveness of kamikaze operations also comforted few Americans. Well after the campaign, the Navy would reveal that 33 ships had been sunk, well over half by kamikazes, and 368 ships and craft damaged, more than 50 seriously. As with calculations of the bombing damage to Japanese cities, various reports give different casualty and damage figures. These are probably accurate to within a ship or two. Carriers also lost 539 planes, but the Japanese cost was staggering. On some days, up to 90% of the planes delivering mass attacks, conventional and kamikaze together, were destroyed, a total of 7,830 for the 3 months of the Okinawan campaign. The kill ratio of the kamikazes alone was naturally far higher, and most of the tiny percentage that managed to crash on ships instead of into the sea did so on superstructures, causing relatively superficial damage. Huge as the attack of April 6th, 7 was, the fleet comprised more ships than the 900 Japanese planes, and none larger than a destroyer was sunk that day or later. Some 4,000 treasures of the nation died for that strategically minor wounding off Okinawa, most of them less than 21 years old. But what mattered to American crews was their own hell, not the enemy's irrationality. When their ships weren't under attack, their lives were tolerable, at least by Pacific War standards. There was often far too much rain and too little usable water. Tense watches at general quarters under deluges in April and May were followed by days and nights of blistering heat that turned ships into furnaces. The sun was so strong by mid-May that a careless touch of a plane parked on a flight deck could cause a burn, and the stifling heat intensified the rashes, diarrhea, and outbreaks of boils in the overcrowded quarters. Still, most crews had dry clothes, relatively clean beds, and 3 squares on most days, unimaginable luxuries to combat infantrymen. During the air attacks, however, supreme terror gripped. There was also fear of kamikaze boats and rumours of Japanese swimmers attaching charges to ships' bottoms, which prompted the posting of guards with submachine guns around the deck and men packing carbines or .45s when they went topside. At night, anything that moved got riddled, Fred Popper would remember. Any sound, any sight including whitecaps, we were plain scared. And when one guy opened up, everybody fired at everything, so there were lots of ricochets and accidents. Transfer to a larger LST on the opposite coast, near Nahar, did nothing to lessen Popper's fear. Kamikazes just poured at us, again and again. It scared the shit out of us, far more than on L-Day. We'd get warnings about half an hour before they appeared, and the waiting was scary too, the knowing what was coming when those pilots' one wish in the world was to kill you. The Japanese called their April 6th 7 Operation Floating Chrysanthemum No. 1. In addition to almost daily missions of 1 to 20 planes, they would stage 9 more such mass attacks at weekly intervals, each launched from a variety of airfields and lasting from 2 to 5 days. The 10 floating chrysanthemums provided shows, awe-inspiring enough to momentarily divert combat troops on land from their anxieties. The spectacle of an armada firing 10,000 guns faster than seemed possible at swarms of attackers was mesmerizing. Norris Buchter spent L-Day night on a slope several hundred yards from the beach where he'd come ashore. The sky above the invasion fleet riding in the darkness offshore was so full of tracer shells from the 1,000-odd ships' anti-aircraft fire that it glowed like coals. It was like 100 July 4ths together. What a terribly magnificent carnival. William Marshall ran to the top of a coral hill on a night later in April to see 2 sections of a severed destroyer emanating an eerie glow as they drifted apart, burning fiercely. When both sections sank, a gigantic explosion sent shockwaves up through the hill, and a blinding light flashed, as though several suns had detonated into the night. When a kamikaze hit an ammunition ship a few evenings earlier, John Grove blinked at a huge multicolored fan of fire and shells on the horizon. The macabre sight was also magnificent, except that I knew it had to mean the death of maybe hundreds of Americans. Medical corpsman Joseph Bangert, the wise guy son of John D. Rockefeller's driver, was on the throne, a hole in the Okinawan ground, one May evening when he saw 2 kamikazes attack New Mexico. One of the battleship's 5-inch shells exploded directly under the first plane, lifting it just clear of her mastheads, but the plane's bomb detonated in a stack, turning it into a giant blowtorch. The second plane, also hit several times, held on and crashed into the gun deck. "That wagon took off like a shot," Bangert remembered in amazement. "I guess to avoid other strikes. I couldn't believe a big ship could move that fast." Although 54 were killed or missing and 119 wounded, New Mexico wasn't listed among the badly damaged ships because she was able to continue fighting. Dick Whittaker watched the daily and nightly spectacle when his company was pulled back for rest and replenishment on high ground, from which both the Pacific Ocean and East China Sea, where ships still extended to the horizon, were sometimes visible. During the day, the ships threw up so much ack-ack that daylight almost disappeared in a million black puffs. During night attacks, the concentration of fire made a kind of twilight incredible. So much fire would have seemed truly impossible if you didn't see it. When Navy construction units nicknamed the Seabees landed soon after the combat troops to begin bulldozing roads for American traffic, they erected a large movie screen on top of a hill. Betty Grable vehicles were favourites, some repeated so often that the audience said the lines along with the actors. But the alternate show of kamikaze pilots diving on frantic ships, also visible from there, sometimes beat the competition. Although American troops would best remember the night attacks that floodlit the sky, the Japanese usually timed their flights to arrive at twilight, when their planes were most difficult to see. Whitaker noticed independently that twilight was the hour of the most awesome shows. It seemed to him inconceivable that a single attacking plane could penetrate a sky solid with smoke from anti-aircraft bursts long enough to reach its target. He watched in amazement as some managed the feat, then crashed into an oily fireball of their bombs, their fuel, and themselves. Ordinarily, he felt little sympathy for swab jockeys. At least they had good chow and could take a shower at night. He didn't know how rare showers actually were. Most ships had to maintain severe water rationing. They could jump into a clean sack, while he and his platoon slept or couldn't sleep, in a hole in the ground, soaked to the skin, freezing our asses off and without the protection of a ship or anything else. But when kamikazes struck, Whitaker felt pity for the crews. Sailors had no foxholes. They couldn't dig in during their moments or hours of terror. Infantrymen nearer the shore who saw the wreckage of ships blown to bits, sometimes with a dozen or so sailors' bodies, were even more aware of the price being paid at sea. The same extravaganza prompted very different reactions in 32nd Army spectators. For the beleaguered defenders, the first reward was a brief suspension of the shelling of their positions while the attention of the American fleet turned skyward. Many Japanese who profited from that blessed break felt guilty toward the young heroes who provided it. Still, the temporary cessation of the enemy's barrages enabled them to relax and enjoy some brief moments watching the Ryogoku. Tokyo's Ryogoku district held a captivating fireworks display every year. A single master switch seemed to turn on the sirens and searchlights of the American ships, a brilliant show in itself. Then the Japanese planes approached with their metallic roar. Picked up by the searchlights, they became the targets of millions of anti-aircraft bullets and shells, a panorama of incomparably gorgeous display. Another Japanese soldier remembered the American fleet's non-essential lights going out in a blink when the kamikazes approached, and the blazing stream of anti-aircraft fire gushing upward with a terrifying explosion. Then we'd catch a glimpse of a plane hurtling down from the sky like a pebble lit up in the beam of a searchlight, or sometimes wrapped in its own flame. The ship's rapid-fire pom-poms awed Japanese soldiers. They threw up tens of thousands of rounds to crisscross the lower sky, like some cosmic fireworks display beneath explosions of higher-caliber automatic shells, beneath, in turn, bursts of flak that blanketed the upper sky. The transfixed soldiers prayed the planes would stay up until they could crash into the targets at which they were aiming with such stunning bravery. When they succeeded, joy surged through the otherwise tormented watchers before they dashed back to cover, often in tears of gratitude. Soon the quick ventures from the caves to watch the spectacle acquired a more formal description: to go worshipping the Special Attack Forces. Inside the caves, maniacally exaggerated reports of the success of the air attacks provided additional exaltation. Masahide Ota and other messengers from 32nd Army headquarters at Shuri Castle distributed uplifting news about kamikaze victories, mainly in the form of a one-sheet newspaper. Our brave Eagles sank 21 enemy ships, it reported on April 7th. 2 days later, 30 were supposedly sunk and 18 crippled. On April 13th, 19 went down. Our Air Force continues attacking with fierce intensity, the paper added. The arrival of such misinformation filled the caves with loud cheers. The tiny newspapers went from hand to hand, surrounded by soldiers who bent over them to read the great tidings for themselves. Few doubted that the virtually non-existent Japanese submarine fleet was in the process of strangling the land enemy by destroying his overextended supply lines. Soon, their wonderfully successful air force would turn to helping them on land. By the campaign's end, it would be claimed that kamikazes sank 49 carriers, battleships, and cruisers. But although the actual total in those categories was zero, the logic that the Americans couldn't continue to lose ships, as they reportedly were, lifted the dejection caused by the Japanese retreats on land and the wretchedness of cave existence. Cheeks shone with optimism in the darkness. Shigemi Furukawa, a former high school teacher, later saw that as part of a curious battlefield psychology in which we took whatever information fed our wishful thinking for certain fact, no matter how often we were disappointed. The wishful thinking extended to some of the highest commanders. Staff officers of Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet based on the home island of Kyushu, spoke of huge enemy losses after each floating chrysanthemum. The admiral thought it almost certain that special attack forces of the first one, on April 6-7, destroyed 4 American carriers. In the light of so many reports of crashes on enemy carriers, he noted in his diary on April 11th, there can't be many undamaged ones still operating. Crashes on the carriers did force a few to suspend operations. The damage and losses were terrible in comparison to what the American Navy had suffered anywhere previously in World War II. But no carrier was put permanently out of action, let alone sunk, during the entire Okinawan campaign. On the second day of the 6th floating chrysanthemum, a kamikaze suddenly dived from some low clouds toward Bunker Hill, one of the carriers whose planes had disposed of Yamato 5 weeks earlier. The Zeke hit the flight deck, setting parked planes alight in a huge conflagration. Just as its bomb penetrated the deck, a Judy dived almost vertically and did the same, its bomb also exploding below. In moments, 3 decks were ablaze, almost the full length of the ship, the inferno fed by more parked planes and aviation fuel in hangar and working spaces. 393 of her crew were killed and missing, and another 264 were wounded, but Bunker Hill survived. 3 days later, in the interval between the 6th and 7th floating chrysanthemums, fighter interceptors and anti-aircraft guns shot down 25 of the 26 planes attacking Enterprise, but the approach of the 26th made throats go dry on the carrier. The worst damage came from a bomb exploding deep in a lower deck. 14 men were killed, 68 wounded. The Big E had been hit twice before, most recently by 2 planes within an hour. This time she had to retire for major repairs in a Navy yard, not to return to sea, like Bunker Hill, until after the war. Royal Navy carriers consistently suffered less damage when hit. 5 of them formed the core of a British fleet that, together with surface support and supply and service vessels, was designated Task Force 57. Its appendage to Iceberg a fortnight before L-Day had been less than an example of heartwarming Anglo-American cooperation. After catastrophic losses early in the war, senior British officers were keen to return to the Indian Ocean, where their former possessions in Burma, Malaya and Indonesia awaited liberation from the Japanese. Suspicious of the old colonial interest, however, their American counterparts strove to keep the Royal Navy out of the Pacific anywhere west of Hawaii, or, failing that, to relegate it to sideshows. They wanted John Bull to share the glory of Japan's final defeat even less than they wanted American resources drained to supply British ships. In the end, however, the political leaders surmounted the military strategic rivalries. Churchill offered Roosevelt the British fleet for Pacific Island campaigns, rather than for any Indian Ocean operation, and the President quickly accepted. But although American staffs then turned characteristically generous with supplies, some high-ranking officers continued nudging the Royal Navy as far aside as possible in order to forestall any possible post-war British claim that they had delivered even the least part of the final blows which demolished the remains of Japanese sea power, as an English historian would see it. Nevertheless, the British worked unsparingly to make Task Force 57 a balanced, self-supporting force. Its main assignment was to neutralize Sakishima Shota, a small archipelago of islands between Formosa and Okinawa. TF-57 repeatedly bombed and shelled those islands, some of which had important military airfields repaired by sedulous Japanese soldiers and native workers after every strike. The fleet's peripheral location, some 300 miles southwest of Okinawa, guaranteed it would have little chance for publicity and every chance of being attacked from enemy airfields on the Chinese mainland, as well as nearby Formosa, where many Japanese pilots were more experienced and skilled than the mainland's young graduates of crash courses. Beginning on L-Day, when they acted as a decoy to divert attention from the vastly larger American force off the landing beaches, the British ships served as a shield across the approaches to the battle site from Formosa and China. But although they were occasionally the principal raid targets, naval design rooted in national attitudes kept their damage relatively minor and casualties relatively few. Working in an atmosphere of determination to avoid World War I's catastrophic casualties, British naval architects had given their carriers flight decks of 3 inches of armour plating instead of teakwood. American designers disliked armoured flight decks because their weight reduced stability and striking power. TF-57's 5 carriers together provided only 244 planes, slightly more than half the number on American carriers of equivalent size. Their steel decks also made the crew's quarters even more like infernos after weeks under the fierce sun. They were also slower, less maneuverable, and less protected by anti-aircraft armament than their American counterparts. Still, their better damage control proved crucial for withstanding kamikaze attacks. All 5 carriers were hit at least once, often with spectacular impact. But the same aircraft that often penetrated wooden American decks and exploded into havoc below usually crumpled up like a scrambled egg in an American observer's simile against British steel. When a kamikaze hits a US carrier, it's 6 months' repair in Pearl Harbor, observed another American. In a carrier, it's sweepers, man your brooms. Although it was never quite that easy for the English virtuoso pilots whose crashes would have put an equivalent American carrier out of action for months, merely slowed the British quarry for several hours or reduced their rate of launching planes. When a Zeke with a 500-pound bomb crashed on Indefatigable's flight deck from an almost vertical dive, the blast killed 8 ratings but left only a 3-inch dent in the heavy steel. Even some multiple fires caused by several nearly simultaneous crashes were extinguished within a quarter of an hour. The chunks of the smashed Japanese planes, and of their pilots, in the form of skull splinters or a single finger stuck to a bulkhead, were pushed over the side, together with the incinerated British ones that had been parked on the flight deck, mostly American-made Avengers, Hellcats and Corsairs. The carriers were fully operational again. At one point, TF-57 set a Royal Navy record since Nelson and the era of sail, 32 continuous days at sea. Throughout them, they diverted a share of the Japanese planes from the vastly larger American fleet, and every diverted kamikaze was a blessing to TF-58. When senior American officers counted their own casualties, their coolness toward the forgotten fleet, as a chronicler later dubbed it, inched toward respect and even a little affection. Of the 7,800 Japanese planes lost, thousands were piloted by youths with barely enough training to get them into the air and attempt the quick dive they prayed would crown their deaths with the additional glory of a hit. Thousands crashed into the sea without coming close to their targets. As is so much in war, it was a matter of chance. Men on unluckier ships became deeply impressed with their attackers' patience and cunning, and with reason. Some were skilled pilots. The experts dived with the velocity of a comet for their targets' vulnerable parts, such as carrier elevators, and chose the most vulnerable moments during plane launching and recovery, when quick maneuvering was extremely difficult. Captains had learned, as one put it, that it was fatal to hold a steady course during an attack. Artful Japanese timing also delivered carrier pilots waiting to take off in their own planes into a special chamber of hell. Strapped into their cockpit seats, they saw kamikazes approaching, and every sailor, except gun crews, racing for cover. Ships could rarely tell whether approaching aircraft were conventional or kamikaze until almost the last moment, when the dives began. When two or more kamikazes dived in a coordinated attack from varying points at varying angles, they much increased the chances of a successful crash, no matter how brilliant the maneuvers to avoid them. Apprehension on the ships increased even further, because the crews could also rarely tell until that last moment whether the planes coming in were piloted by experts or novices. Looking up at 500-pound bombs strapped to bellies or extra fuel tanks under each wing, they tried to guess. Even an almost empty plane could be lethal. In one case, a wheel bounced off a kamikaze and decapitated a gunner, who had been firing furiously until the moment of the crash he was desperately hoping to prevent. Near misses, too, could cause significant damage. Another kamikaze totally disabled its target ship by hitting the water hard and close enough to flood both boiler and engine compartments. Attacks against the capital ships naturally attracted the most attention, but the tin cans and other attendant vessels suffered proportionately more. Human resources are almost always more strained on smaller naval ships, and many of those in particular were intentionally stationed directly in harm's way. Sitting ducks of Okinawa, as one observer called them. To protect the main body of the fleet, the Americans established a ring of 16 early warning radar picket stations in the most probable approaches of the attacking planes, ranging out to about 75 miles from Okinawa. That was in addition to Task Force 58's own picket group and to some 75 American planes always orbiting in concentric circles above the island and the picket ships during daylight. Those carrier-based combat air patrols shot down hundreds of easy pickings, but also risked flak from their own side's ships with daredevil courage during the thick of the floating chrysanthemums. Destroyers and destroyer escorts did most of that dangerous picketing in slow-speed circles, although mine-layers, smaller gunboats and landing craft were soon added in the effort to increase anti-aircraft firepower against the swarms of attackers. Since many shaky pilots were unable to keep their rickety planes aloft long enough to reach the choicer targets of the carriers and transports, those unarmoured little craft took a disproportionate share of the dives. Although kamikazes badly damaged 13 American carriers, 10 battleships and 5 cruisers off Okinawa, only smaller ships with their skimpier anti-aircraft armament went down, a dozen between late March and the end of June, in addition to 3 sunk by conventional air attacks. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison concluded that destroyer crews living in daily and nightly terror of them were probably under greater stress for a longer period than had previously been experienced by any seaman serving in a surface fleet. That drew a greater distinction between kamikaze and conventional attacks than most Japanese themselves would have made. Many veteran pilots considered too valuable for the former flu strikes that were suicidal in all but name. They wore no parachutes and didn't expect to return. By the 6th week, the demarcation between kamikaze missions and ordinary ones was increasingly blurred. They were all human bullets, Dennis and Peggy Warner argued, whether they chose to die in kamikaze aerial attacks, in banzai charges, in okas, or on small boats loaded with explosives. And although most of the less publicized Japanese infantry was not specifically suicidal, its night attacks, especially by units that had been reduced to near inoperative, were almost the same. Very few of Ushijima's 80,000 regular troops expected to return to Japan, nor did the 20,000 to 30,000 Okinawans conscripted in the Home Guard expect to live, though a far larger percentage of them wanted to. Besides, chroniclers understandably overwhelmed by the shipboard terror had little notion of the suffering on Okinawa itself. It is probably true that never in the annals of our glorious naval history have naval forces done so much with so little against such odds for so long a period, as the commander of the radar pickets claimed. But the land battle was harder, and many Japanese units did a lot more with a lot less against incomparably greater odds for a longer period. Americans on ships hit by kamikazes had only a brief taste of the experience of Japanese soldiers on the island, who for months faced an almost constant rain of bullets, shells, and bombs. Still, the ordeal of the radar picket vessels was indeed unprecedented in many ways. On and on went the kamikaze attacks, bringing dread to sailors who didn't want to believe the crazy Japanese had more planes left after so many had been shot down. But they had thousands left, never mind their condition, and the grim drama with the spectacular sights and unequalled intensity played again and again. The pilots' half-hypnotic last minutes in their planes, the tension on the ships below, the guns with the glowing barrels, the sky red with tracers and almost literally black with bursts of anti-aircraft shells, the sea churned up by spray from the shorts, the crew members rushed to toilets to cool feet seared by their decks, the absence of relief from shooting down any part of an attacking force, because it was always the last plane that scored, the hope that no crash would come amidships to make the ship go dead in the water and become a sitting duck, the gun crew's unflinching fire as planes did hit, engulfing them in flames, the jettisoning of anchors, torpedoes, guns, and all other possible weight to try to save listing vessels, damage control crews operating as bucket brigades when all power was lost and the fire hoses were useless, burned survivors struggling to stay afloat in a sludge of sea, oil and blood around crippled and sinking hulks, into which new bombs fell. Knots of sailors using their last energy for an excited burst of swimming toward rescue vessels and dying of exhaustion, other knots drowned by big seas, crushed by the hulls of sister ships come to help, or wriggling from their life jackets and letting themselves slide under, even though possible rescue was near, because they could stand no more agony. The destroyer Laffey's picket station during the third floating chrysanthemum was on a straight line between Kyushu and Okinawa. Enemy planes filled her radar screen, up to 50 closing bogies at one point, from first light of April 16th. During one 80-minute period, at least 22 planes dived at her from all points of the compass. Her decks were repeatedly strafed. One bomb scored a near miss, 4 others hit. One kamikaze splashed almost alongside, 6 others crashed home. 8 hit another tin can on another day. Ton for gross ton, the attack was probably more intense than even Yamato had experienced, and Laffey's trial, until being taken in tow by a sister ship, lasted almost as long. Despite the explosions, flames and casualties, 31 missing and killed, 72 wounded, no gun was abandoned, although only 4 of her 20mm were operable when the Japanese broke off. Those small-caliber guns proved little use in stopping a determined pilot. Even direct hits by the larger ones often failed to do that. One of the most remarkable scenes of the whole remarkable tableau was of Japanese planes lurching forward on their collision courses, even when repeatedly hit and in flames, even when their pilots were riddled and parts of the planes had broken off and spun into the sea. No amount of fire from a ship under attack ensured her safety until the attacker or swarm of them fell into the sea. The strain from that enemy bravery added further to the anxiety. A Japanese writer's recent claim that the sight of a single Japanese plane raised terror in the hearts of men on the enemy vessels conveyed an essential truth. The desperation of nearly all combatants to take out the enemy in battle had an added edge when nothing but shooting down the relentless planes in time and far enough away could save the targeted ships from fierce damage. Such furious firing, of course, led to even more mistakes than usual when masses of young men were operating an immense assemblage of complex guns. "I saw something today which made my blood run cold, something I shan't soon forget," said an officer on a landing ship medium on April 6th during the first floating chrysanthemum. American gunners had shot down a Hellcat, a blunder that would be repeated regularly in the frenzy of defense. When a ship's power was knocked out, as often happened, gun crews operated their guns manually, work so arduous that healthy young men with adrenaline pumping could keep it up for only 2 minutes. Nothing better illustrated the old Asian proverb about dying twice when one knows one is about to die. Permanent general quarters would have exhausted the crews beyond ability to function reasonably. With hundreds of extra duties to keep the ships as ready and as free of inflammable materials as possible, steaming day and night under the usual normal high-condition watches was depleting enough. On top of that, nerves were exposed and quivering like wires stripped of insulation, in the image of one sober chronicler. Despite fire and damage control skills honed in repeated encounters, the new repair berths in Karama Retto swelled with gutted ships and hulks. The final toll of naval casualties over the course of the campaign would be 4,907 killed or missing, and 4,824 wounded, far more than in any previous battle of the war, including one-sided Pearl Harbor, where fewer than half that number died. It was extremely rare for the number of deaths to exceed the number of wounded as here, testimony to the infernos ignited by the crashes. Nearly 20% of the Navy's total casualties in the Pacific, Atlantic, and all smaller seas throughout the war were inflicted off Okinawa. Only 45 kamikazes would participate in the 10th Floating Chrysanthemum on June 21st, 22, down from the first's 355. On average, the 8 in between involved progressively fewer planes, but without proportionate relief of strain in the fleet. And those Japanese numbers decreased partly because officers on the home islands had already begun husbanding for the struggle there, for which they'd be able to muster 10,000 or more planes for kamikaze use. When B-29S joined TF-58's carrier strikers bombing mainland fields in mid-April, many Japanese planes were transferred from the Navy to Operation Ketsu, last resort, under overall command of the Imperial Army. The honor of its chiefs, who also controlled the government, unconditionally required a final battle on the mainland, whatever the odds, even if, or precisely because, there was no hope of winning. The spectre of ultimate defeat increased rather than diminished the commitment to special attacks. "I see the war situation becoming more desperate," a squadron leader wrote in his cockpit moments before following 5 of his pilots in their final dives at Okinawa. "All Japanese must become soldiers and die for the Emperor." The Shuri Line. On the morning of May 9th, 39 days after L-Day and 19 after the North had been officially secured, platoon leader Paul Dunphy huddled with 45 men on the northern bank of a small river 20 miles south of the landing beaches. The brackish Asakawa, Asa River, runs almost due west from Shuri Heights, oozing its way into the East China Sea a few miles above Naha. Lieutenant Dunphy's platoon, which had been delivered there from relatively easy anti-guerrilla patrols in the north only the day before, had been ordered to scout across the river. Crossing at low tide, it pushed several hundred yards farther south to 2 low hills, making note of the defensive positions that dotted them. They would make the territory sheer hell to take, Dunphy reckoned. He was impressed by the enemy's fire discipline. His men saw Japanese soldiers ducking back into caves and observing them from machine gun nests in well-placed vantage points, but all held their fire. The scope and ingenuity of their positions impressed him even more. Many caves had entrances on both slopes. Others housed artillery pieces covered by branches or canvas. Dunphy had been promoted to lieutenant after his platoon leader was killed on Guadalcanal, then acquired more combat experience in Okinawa's north, but he'd never seen such defensive skill and strength. His unhappy scouting completed, he tried to hurry his men back to relative safety. The enemy opened fire when the unit was most vulnerable, back at the Asakawa. Many Japanese kept their positions concealed by firing only when his men's backs were turned. A little like the Japanese army, Marines were much more practiced at advance than withdrawal. Crossing in chest-high water with rifles over their heads, that group made fine targets, especially Dunphy himself, at whom much of the fire was concentrated. The loss of his young runner inches beside him caused an additional problem. A buddy of the dead man began hauling the body back, despite the additional risk to himself and Dunphy. The lieutenant had to kick ass on the weeping corporal, one of his best men, and order his platoon sergeant to get everyone the hell back across the river now. A second man was killed in the 90-minute struggle to do that. Later that day, Dunphy was summoned to 6th Division headquarters in a former Japanese command post. Some 40 officers were there, underground, including Major General Lemuel Shepard, the 6th Division's commander, and his boss, Lieutenant General Simon Buckner, commander of the entire 10th Army. Dunphy answered their questions and was dismissed. He started to leave, then turned back to ask permission to add something. He wanted to say the questions hadn't allowed him to paint the full grim picture of what he'd observed. When the Japanese artillery at last opened up on his men, there were not merely very many more guns than he'd expected, but they were also positioned to give them meshed lines of fire down on all lines of advance and excellent protection from American counterfire. "Dismissed!" a staff officer roared before Dunphy could reopen his mouth. But a second officer called him back, and he was permitted to wonder aloud whether a frontal assault could take such excellent positions. At 3 o'clock the following morning, his weakened platoon was the second to cross a rope bridge strung across the Asakawa by engineers earlier that night. So much for his misgivings. His men had orders to hold their fire, light no cigarettes, move soundlessly. They hoped a dense fog blanketing the little valley would conceal an attack planned for dawn 3 hours hence. But Japanese flares kept lighting the night, and when the leader of the first platoon to cross the bridge reached its far side, just ahead of Dunphy, 2 enemy rifles were pointed at him from close enough to be seen through the fog. They shot down the American hope for surprise. Still, Dunphy's group moved out on time, at 6 a.m., almost blindly in the fog, whereas the defenders had clearly taken great pains to pinpoint the only possible lines of advance. It was no surprise to the lieutenant that extremely heavy fire pinned down his men in minutes. Half an hour later, he felt a great thud in his stomach. Machine-gun bullets and fragments of his belt buckle had severed his bowel. Although a corpsman risked his own life to reach the exposed platoon leader with sulphur, it was almost 7 hours of desperate gasping for breath before he could be evacuated. The Japanese, who had so scrupulously held their fire the day before, were now delivering much too much of it to allow a stretcher to be brought out. Paul Dunphy didn't know he'd played a bit part in the campaign's feature attraction, set at the main Japanese defensive line. If he'd gotten through that morning without serious injury, his chances for the same during the rest of May would have been negligible. A mile south of his wounding, the terrain of terraces, steep escarpments and rugged ravines approached perfection for defence. The 32nd Army had carved the limestone and coral of each commanding hill there into a kind of land battleship. Outdoing themselves in excavation and construction, the men had fashioned defensive masterpieces, largely impervious to the fire of the American fleet offshore, as well as of the land artillery and the bombers. Many were contiguous or had protected access from one to another. Where possible, they'd been tunnelled with bends just inside the entrances to limit the fire entering the interiors. A single sector of well less than half a square mile would be found to contain 16 hidden light mortars, 83 light machine guns, 41 heavy machine guns, 7 anti-tank guns, 6 field guns, 2 mortars, and 2 howitzers. The most extensive works were in the high ground protecting Shuri, which would have been difficult to take even with less shrewd and elaborate preparations. Centuries of Okinawan kings had built forts on those natural defensive sites, where Shuri Castle was now the keystone of Ushijima's attrition strategy. Not even 16-inch naval shells could disturb the deep, vast tunnel beneath it, almost 1,300 feet long, with blower-assisted ventilation shafts that served as 32nd Army headquarters. The castle stood on a high knob near the city's southern edge. East and west from there, the line was carved and constructed across the island's full 12-mile width. Anchored by the Asakawa on the west coast, the Shuri Heights in the centre, and a hill mass at Yonabaru on the east Pacific coast, the mighty system of artfully placed fortifications was like a corregidor for the bulk of the 32nd Army. For all the late start, logistical difficulties, interference by American air raids, loss of the 9th Division, and other setbacks, the defenders' prodigious labour had built their most formidable positions of the Pacific War on terrain best suited for them. Americans who'd later inspect the works would hardly credit that they'd been completed in under a year. "I couldn't believe those underground forts," one Marine marvelled for thousands. Two-tiered quarters, running water, everything beautifully engineered. That's why you never saw a Japanese most of the time. They'd be bombed, bombarded, napalmed, and safe inside those thousands of caves. Some with mouths so small you wouldn't see them until you were almost right on them and they started shooting. Bingo! In and out of the caves, hidden positions were placed for the best flat trajectory fire directly on areas where attackers would have no cover or concealment. Major and minor strongpoints were integrated to provide intersecting, interlocking fields of fire for artillery, mortar, machine gun, and small arms fire, and the vantage points from the heights facilitated their coordination for rare accuracy, economy, and effect. Mounted on tracks, artillery pieces could be rolled to the mouth of their camouflaged cave or emplacement, fired once or twice, and rolled back out of sight before their positions could be fixed, as in the north, but with 30 times more firepower. Little zeroing in was required, because that had been done on a tight grid for everything significant, down to boulders and clumps of trees. The attackers would have to advance exposed or marked. Some complexes in the network of trenches, galleries, caves, and tunnels were almost 2 miles long. While protecting the Japanese infantry from all but the heaviest and most accurate airstrikes and naval and artillery fire, it provided the best possible firing positions and concealment for their weapons, and the system's depth would enable withdrawals to be made with maximum secrecy and safety. The full advantage of exits at both the front and rear of caves, and sometimes on the flanks of the hills, was about to become clear. They would much facilitate the shifting and concentrating of limited resources to meet changing battle needs. The defenders would be able to reinforce units on their forward slopes by sending fresh troops and supplies from the rear exits, or even from adjoining hills, from where they couldn't be expected. Colonel Yahara, the brilliant operations officer, and General Cho, the fiercely goading chief of staff, had devised a defensive tour de force and contrived to get their troops, the indefatigable movers of earth, to build it during the year of preparation. And once again, American reconnaissance had failed, as it would again, even using its much-improved technology in the Vietnam War, to uncover the nature and magnitude of the defences, even the number of defenders, which it underestimated by almost 40%. Military histories rightly dwell on the 32nd Army's maze of caves, interconnecting tunnels well stocked with grenades, with approaches well mined and covered by barbed wire, and supported by fierce mortar, artillery, and machine gun fire. However, it may be enough to say here that Americans began speaking of the Little Siegfried Line. By early May, the nature of the Japanese resistance on the island's southern third had become clear, and it was the worst possible kind for the offence, fought entirely from the skillful underground complexes under commanders whose ultimate purpose was to die in combat. The Americans' early April optimism was replaced by an acceptance that Okinawa would be no exception to the Japanese rule of savage fighting for every rise, hill, tomb, and cave. Now it promised to be the war's harshest confirmation of that rule, until the even bloodier fighting that would have to follow on the mainland. Against such opposition, it seemed sensible to take one's time, blasting and blasting again with every available shell before advancing with bodies, which is what the 40,000 troops of the Army's 7th and 96th Divisions had been doing almost since L-Day. While the 6th Marine Division had been racing for the north, the Army had been bearing the brunt of the Japanese power on a hard grind south. The first serious barrier, the northernmost from Shuri, stood only a few miles below the landing beaches. 5 days after L-Day, strongpoints there stopped the advance of many Army units, which were forced to attack Cactus Ridge and the Pinnacle again and again before taking them, with heavy casualties. Although hills and rises were identified by numbers on the map, the customary American nicknaming began immediately. The 40-odd-foot Pinnacle, atop which Commodore Perry's party may have planted an American flag 92 years earlier, served as an introduction to rises that seemed piddling until the attacker's approach prompted fire from concealed caves, bunkers, and a collection of stone and concrete tombs converted to pillboxes. Interlocking fire from adjacent rises and hills left no weak point to attack. Those small fortresses gave a taste of what lay ahead. On April 9th, 2 battalions of the 96th Division's 383rd Infantry Regiment launched a major attack on seemingly unimpressive Kakazu Ridge, which actually anchored a major defensive line some 4 miles north of the main Shuri line. It took units of one Army division 7 days and over 1,100 casualties to advance 6,000 yards. Units of the other needed 3 days of intense attack to capture a single small hill in a line studded with them. The army tried again a week later as part of a general offensive against the whole line, after softening up Kakuzu Ridge in particular with the biggest bang of the entire Pacific War so far. 324 American artillery. Pieces fired 19,000 shells at enemy positions. 18 warships joined the bombardment. 650 planes dropped bombs and napalm, and also fired rockets and machine guns. That was the industrial aspect of American warfare. Before the end of the campaign, Army and Marine field guns alone would fire 1,766,352 rounds, but they were far less effective than ordnance statistics implied against the Japanese there, who remained underground, ignored casualties, and rushed out to fight when the bombardment let up. However restricted and weakened by the heavy guns, Japanese soldiers retained the power to fire rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces at chosen moments. Perfectly positioned anti-tank guns wreaked havoc. In one small action below Kakuzu Ridge, those guns and squads armed with satchel charges, like the one whose accidental explosion had wounded Tadashi Kojo, swiftly destroyed or immobilized 22 of 30 American tanks. The situation was so favorable for counterattack that Ushijima ignored his own prohibition of them and ordered a small one. Soon, nearly 60 American tanks were blown up or captured. When Americans managed to gouge openings in the line, the defenders used their network of tunnels and hidden trenches to seal them, day after day. "You can't bypass a Jap," an army officer lamented, "because a Japanese doesn't know when he's bypassed." Kakuzu Ridge wasn't taken until April 24th, when army commanders discovered its defenders had withdrawn during the previous night's fog and an unusually powerful artillery barrage, but only to the next series of even more formidable hills, about a mile farther south. Still, the Americans were advancing, however slowly and painfully. Prudent minds still considered it safest and surest to tread ahead cautiously, relying on sheer weight of metal. That was the conviction of most of the 10th Army's staff, including General Buck Buckner, commander of the 155,000 American troops on the ground. Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. was a stolid man who liked to take as few risks as possible. If it had been up to him alone, Okinawa might have been less costly in American infantry casualties, but only at the expense of the greater naval losses a slower advance would have brought. The welfare of the native population, whose suffering was bound to increase with the length of the campaign, was not a consideration. The American commander had soldiered for 37 years since graduating from West Point in 1908. Exemplary service before, during, and after World War I earned him regular promotions. As much as a parallel was possible in two countries of such contrasting culture and traditions, Lieutenant General Simon Buckner was an American version of Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. The upbringing and training of both seemed to have pointed them toward their commands on Okinawa almost from birth. Buckner's father, a Civil War hero, attained the rank of lieutenant general, and later had a distinguished civilian career that included the governorship of Kentucky. Buckner may have been a shade less prominent in the American military establishment than Ushijima in the Japanese, but he was equally devoted to soldiering and only soldiering, and among the most respected and popular of the Army's top brass. As Ushijima had had the honor of commanding the Imperial Military Academy, punctilious Buckner had the same at West Point in the late 1930s. He too was the picture of a general, down to rugged good looks topped by thick white hair. At 58, a year older than Ushijima, he kept himself in excellent shape. More to the point, the leading army schoolmaster, as he was known for his years of studying and teaching in the highest staff schools, had a firm command of battle strategy and tactics. He'd led the American campaign in the Aleutian Islands in 1943, and his decoration for exceptionally distinguished and meritorious service was more than the standard Army boilerplate. Although a commanding officer's personal example was generally less important to American troops than to Japanese, GIs generally admired the big, handsome, ruddy, strong-bodied man, as one saw him now. He trained them hard, but his commanding presence was free of arrogance. As much as fighting troops could have positive feelings about anyone at headquarters, most of the 10th Armies felt the commander and his staff were a skilled collection. He'd assumed its command in August 1944, the month when Ushijima took command of the much smaller 32nd Army. If the campaign against Formosa hadn't been cancelled, he would have led it with the same force. On Okinawa, he was commanding 3 Marine divisions as well as 4 Army ones, but to the considerable extent that he went by the book, it was the Army book. His instinct was to defeat the enemy by applying the Army's standard use of superior force. Moreover, he naturally leaned toward the conservative side of the generally conservative army. Except for a brief tour in aviation, he was an infantryman with special skills in tanks. "We'll take our time and kill the Japanese gradually," he'd told correspondents about his intentions for May. And now, during May, "You will see many Japanese killed. You will see them gradually rolled back. But you won't see spectacular advances because this isn't that kind of fighting." But the Old Man of the Mountain, as he was also called, was now under pressure to fight a more imaginative campaign than the step-by-solid step that came naturally to him. Among others, it was being applied by his superior, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who'd urged making Okinawa rather than Formosa the next target after Iwo Jima. That gave the Admiral an extra measure of concern about the progress of the campaign, about which he hadn't shared the early optimism. After the first week's relative ease, capped by the sinking of Yamato, Vice Admiral Richmond Turner, Iceberg's overall commander, sent him a jocular radio signal. "I may be crazy, but it looks like the Japanese have quit the war, at least in this section." Nimitz's succinct reply reflected his character. "Delete all after crazy." It was the following day that Army units first encountered the Little Siegfried Line in the unassuming shape of Kakuzu Ridge. And now Admiral Turner's overconfidence had switched to hot-tempered criticism of General Buckner. Buckner couldn't have pleased everyone. Campaign commanders everywhere had to reckon with a fundamental difference between the Army's and Marine Corps' fighting styles, the Army generally attacking much more deliberately with heavier weapons than the leaner Marines, who moved out faster with less equipment and more initial risk. Army forces usually had the wherewithal for campaigns of attrition and tended to fight them as long as the defence remained organised and powerful. Marine leadership, always hurried by limitations of time and supply, believed fewer men would be lost in the end by constant advance, using flanking movements if possible, instead of burrowing into foxholes while softening up the enemy, and allowing his artillery and mortars to do their damage at the same time. The Marine credo had been developed in smaller campaigns than this one, and against less entrenched opposition. There the men did what they were best trained for: storm beachheads, win quick victories in small areas, ship out to the next destination. And it wasn't logically certain that units moving forward rapidly suffered fewer casualties than those that waited in position until weather, support, and other factors were favourable. But rapid advance did boost morale, on which the Corps heavily depended. Words like assault, take, and capture tripped even from Dick Whittaker, no master of strategy or tactics. But he'd been a Marine long enough to know that our philosophy was advance, advance, advance. It became a battle only when the advance was stopped for some reason. Since every teenage private knew he wasn't winning, if not advancing, it was almost inevitable that when the strong points stopped the Marines now, in early May, some staff and higher field officers proposed outflanking them with another amphibious operation well south of the Shuri Line. A few High Army officers, including Major General John Hodge, commander of the Twelfth Force Corps that comprised the 7th and 96th Divisions, had already pressed Buckner to do the same. But the Marine leadership was even more outspoken in the effort to move the land commander from his slug-it-out strategy. Unhappy with what they saw as Buckner's lack of appreciation for manoeuvre, the dissenters, who included General Shepard, the commander of the 6th Marine Division that had taken the north, wanted to shorten the campaign with a daring end run. They specified it should be made by the 2nd Marine Division, which was in reserve on Saipan after Elday's sham landing in the south, in order to deter Ushijima from moving reinforcements to the real landing beaches. That division, a veteran of amphibious assaults, should now return to the place of its feint, the southeast beaches of Minatagawa on the Pacific coast, which were promising enough to have been an alternative site for the real landings. Supported by those arguments and by the Marine Corps Commandant, General Alexander Vandergrift, on a visit to Okinawa, the Marines pressed their case. They were convinced Buckner's predictable frontal assault took more time and cost more lives in the end than quick, hard strikes that would stop the enemy from making his skillful retreats to the next prepared barriers, as at Kakazu. Such nighttime withdrawals at the last moment before the besieged barriers were overwhelmed were allowing the Japanese to sustain their defences just as they'd planned. Buckner's rejection of those proposals was grounded in soldierly resolve. He'd made up his mind, and in the very caution of which he was accused. Kamikazes had cost the 10th Army 2 ammunition supply ships. The commander and his staff insisted that another fighting front would break down his supply system, although the 2nd Marine Division said it had enough logistical support to sustain itself for at least a month of fighting on Okinawa. Buckner also wanted to keep the 2nd fresh for the July landings planned for a tiny Ryukyu island midway between Okinawa and the Japanese mainland. Besides, the general argued, the 32nd Army's tactics and artillery strength and the steep cliffs dominating the possible southern landing sites would have made a new amphibious operation another Anzio, but worse. Japanese guns did have a direct line of fire to the coral-strewn beaches below, and a few high naval officers also doubted proper cover could be mounted for another landing there. However, high-ranking Japanese officers, including Colonel Yahara, thought Minatagawa would make a good landing beach for the Americans, and such an operation would be their most damaging move. Buckner surely wouldn't have changed his mind if he'd known that a landing below Shuri might have averted the coming catastrophe for Okinawan civilians. He might have reconsidered had his intelligence suggested what more the little Siegfried Line had in store for the 10th Army itself. But it didn't. His confident prediction of hard, but not overly hard victory was based on the optimism of ignorance. Taking the bull by the horns at a press conference now, he opened it by comparing a new landing to a general's naval. You'd look totally stupid without one, but it serves no purpose. That disarmed most of the reporters, but not Homer Bigart of the New York Herald Tribune. Bigart's almost aberrant criticism of the failure to stage that second landing and catch the Japanese in a pincer movement would spark a heated post-mortem controversy in the States. Although politicians and journalists knew but a fraction of the hardship caused by the Shuri Line, that was enough for American newspapers to begin criticizing Buckner's conduct of the campaign, surely encouraged by the Marine Corps Commandant after he'd returned to Washington. Newspapers complained about Buckner's devotion to wooden frontal tactics. Some went further, suggesting the ultra-conservative campaign had been a fiasco and a worse example of military incompetence than Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nimitz, conciliatory by nature, would join those who deplored the criticism, going out of his way to applaud Buckner and praise the Army's magnificent performance. But that admirable exercise in team play was intended to mask inter-service friction, and it too would come after the fact. Now, when it mattered, his reaction to Buckner's leadership was quite different. The advance was stalled. The 400 planes of the 3rd Floating Chrysanthemum had just swarmed over the fleet. Leadership wrangling was threatening to break out into the open, so Nimitz flew to Okinawa for some straight talk with Buckner. Like the Marines, the modest admiral wanted faster results in order to reduce the kamikaze's unprecedented damage to his fleet. He may also have been having second thoughts about the whole campaign, the ill-considered decision to take Okinawa by storm, as one historian would describe it, that left no other way for Buckner but straight ahead into the sausage machine. In any case, the relatively huge toll in American ships and crews deeply disturbed him, and he was uncharacteristically sharp in a meeting with Buckner on April 23rd, ordering the general to speed things up. Buckner countered that the ground campaign was an army operation, his business. Nimitz restated his point without mincing words. "I'm losing a ship and a half a day, So if this line isn't moving in 5 days, we'll get someone up here to move it so we can all get out from under these damn kamikaze attacks. Although that, of course, went unreported to 10th Army troops, the magic of scuttlebutt quickly apprised them of the conversation's substance. Perhaps Niemitz, sick, put a spark up Buckner's butt-sick, a lowly Marine speculated in his diary a few days later. Whatever the merits of the conflicting strategies, however many thousands of lives might or might not have been saved by dropping characteristic Army caution, it must be said that lack of information and imagination played a large part in the ultimate decision, together with the tendency to underestimate the Japanese that had been present from the start. Some of the bloodiest weeks in American history were approaching, and when the results are compared to the planning, the latter appears seriously inadequate. As so often in war, the larger possibilities and potential consequences, which ought to have been clear from previous wars, were set aside or not raised at all. Buckner had already chosen his tactical objectives, and his resolve to reach them with firepower and more firepower remained unchanged. But he did try to get the line moving again, partly by exchanging one of his army divisions for the 6th Marine Division. His order for that came on the 5th day of the 5 Nimitz had given him. That is what delivered Paul Dunphy's platoon down from the north to the defensive fury at the Asakawa on May 9th and 10 days after all Okinawa was supposed to be in American hands, according to the plans. The Army Division exchanged for the 6th Marines was a National Guard unit from New York that had been sent into foreign combat, a rare exception in American practice, with little reorganization. No one who hasn't fought in the killing zone, within rifle range of the enemy, has a right to criticize those who have. But the record shows that the 27th Division also went into combat with a higher-than-average percentage of inexperienced officers. On Saipan, where it had fought the year before, its failure to match the achievements of other units in the Bloody Line had led to controversy. Marine General Holland, Howlin' Mad Smith, the corps commander, sent it back into reserve and swore never to use it again. The 27th's 16,000 troops were roughly of the same human stuff as the other divisions. Even most Marine leaders acknowledge that the man-to-man difference between Marine and Army troops in action is insignificant. If anything, therefore, that proves only the importance of training, especially in this case of senior officers. On Okinawa, the 27th had been sent into the line on April 9th, after the going in the south got rough. It saw heavy action during the rest of the month, principally at Kakuzu Ridge and 2 deadly strongpoints of the next major Japanese barrier south. One was Item Pocket, a large rise located in the eye or item grid square on the American battle map. It was one of Okinawa's best natural defensive positions and most cleverly prepared, a lethal citadel of skillfully mounted armament with no approach except by exposure to its many bands of fire. Taking the interlocking ridges required repeated feats of arms and bravery. The progress had been slow, perhaps necessarily so, but many companies distinguished themselves. However, 2 fled in disarray from intense fire, one of the rare such instances during the entire Okinawan campaign. Few Marines knew anything specific about the record of the 27th on Saipan or on Making or Eniwetok, where it had also fought. Even fewer knew that it had originally been in floating reserve status at Okinawa, earmarked for garrison duty after the island's taking, or that, despite the setbacks at the deadly positions against which it had been hurriedly committed, it often fought hard and well. 6th Division Marines in particular had no idea that Ushijima's real defence had been prepared in that southernmost eighth of the island from which they were most distant. But the facts would have made little difference to most Marines, because they had an underlying contempt, as a critically admiring corpsman who tended their wounded put it, for everyone else. If you weren't a Marine, you weren't much of anything. Special contempt for the Army in particular was built into their elite training, one of the prods that charged them to advance faster against more seemingly unassailable positions than miserable soldiers. William Manchester has claimed that several Marines sent 2 souvenir-hunting Army officers to their almost certain deaths on Okinawa by pointing them in the direction of Japanese snipers. If that was true, It was an awesome example, as Dick Whittaker would call it, of the bad feelings between the 6th Marine Division and 27th Army Division in particular, but not an entirely unbelievable example. Every Marine considered every soldier a doggy and barked at him, Manchester added. Most Marines more or less despised doggies all the way up to their top one in the Pacific, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. Although Marines had taken higher casualties on many islands, here so far it was the reverse. When the 6th Division Marines were sent south in late April and early May, Army casualties were 7 times greater than theirs. The many dangerously weakened Army units included the sterling 383rd Regiment, which, although badly mauled during its attacks on Kakazoo Ridge, had to relieve the 382nd Regiment because the latter was down to half strength, while the 305th was even more depleted. And the 27th Division's casualties during its hardest 2 weeks in April were almost as great as both Marine divisions suffered during the full month. Its losses at Item Pocket, still 3 miles above the main Shuri line, were proportionately the highest of the entire campaign. If Marines knew none of that, they fumed with the knowledge that they were indeed less well supplied than their larger sister service. The grudge they nursed served as more inducement for showing up the fat, dumb doggies, and as justification for appropriating their treasures. One June evening, Dick Whittaker would come upon an Army tank unit setting up its mess tent, itself a startling extravagance to Marines in combat, who lived entirely in holes and ate rations. Whittaker and a company mate named Jack Crary entered the tent to find a mess sergeant inside, together with a stack of canned hams, wild luxury after months of fighting on Marine subsistence. Crary asked for a can, and the sergeant told him to get lost. The former unslung his rifle and pointed it. "Too bad you feel that way, but we're taking that ham anyway." The sergeant handed him the can, and the 2 typically rabid Marines, as he obviously saw them, backed out of the tent like bank robbers, until Whittaker saw his favourite weapon, a Thompson submachine gun, hanging on the tent's centre pole. "Well, as long as Jack's taking the ham," he reasoned with impeccable Marine logic, "I'm taking that." The 2 then made their escape into the Okinawan night. Even Marines with the least interest in military philosophy had a practical sense of the differences in fighting styles. They knew they were not only trained, but also organised and supplied, or undersupplied, for fast assaults as opposed to the ponderous Army's plodding advances, attempted only when an overwhelming numerical advantage had been assembled. Until then, Marines sneered, those lumps just stayed in their foxholes, and what foxholes, like houses, and hoped artillery would do their jobs for them. Wrong as that often was, grave as shortages of supplies could be for Army units too, it remained generally true that the Marines' determination to advance with relatively small forces against all opposition was usually fiercer than the Army's. That push had been amply illustrated during the race to take the north. When the commander of the 29th Regiment was relieved on April 10th, CP 120, his slowness in taking Yaidaka Mountain wasn't the full cause. After bitter hand-to-hand fighting, the colonel asked his boss, the divisional commander, for a 24-hour break to give his tired men a rest and a chance to change their socks. The heavily decorated veteran of many hard battles was gone the following day, and although that angered his men, they were also proud of the relentlessness with which they were driven. Finally, the Marines up north had heard many rumours about the performance of the useless 27th Division, and the nearness of mortal danger gave rumours the advantage over the unavailable truth. The stories ranged from the division being pinned down and unable to move, which was partially true, to having such low morale and integrity that it couldn't even recover its dead, the most unforgivable failure to Marines, since honouring their dead fused their half-mystical comradeship. So the 27th's behaviour was inexcusable, and that's not rumour because I was one of the Marines who recovered some of their dead for them under enemy fire. Simply notorious. But other rumours were silly, and cocky Marines, ignorant of what the Army had been facing in the south for almost a month, loved spreading them. Admiral William Halsey, who alternated commanding the 5th Fleet, had supposedly told Buckner that he was going to pull his Navy and Marines out of Okinawa if he couldn't get the Army to move its fat ass. What most bothered 6th Division Marines with access to real news from the south were reports that Japanese firepower, especially artillery, was devastating, and that their own brothers in the 1st Marine Division were being killed unnecessarily because the 27th Division was leaving them exposed on the flanks, as they heard it had done to Marines on Saipan, by not advancing on schedule to silence that artillery. Besides, the 6th Division also feared that this would mean the end of that other good rumour, that they'd soon be out of Okinawa and back on Guam. The transfer itself might have provided a war movie's comic relief. Marine wags posted road signs reading Marines and Men pointing south, and Army or 27th Division pointing north, together with USO and rest area. When their trucks passed each other, sometimes within inches, they shouted abuse at the retreating doggies and flung back the candy bars a few friendly GIs had tossed them with insulting barks. But other soldiers pretended to film the leathernecks, mocking them as gung-ho savages who craved glory at any cost. Go ahead and bark, you live like dogs anyway. The greenest Marines were likely to shout the loudest. Combat veterans tended to be quieter. But all cast an envious eye at Army riches. When a 27th Division truck tipped over the shoulder of a meagre road, a band of Marines stole their better carbines and ran off. 40 years later, 6th Division veterans would dwell on the exchange. What really made the memory durable was that it marked the trauma of returning to battle from the relative comfort and safety of the mopping-up patrols and other occupation duties up north. I'd never been in combat before, so our fighting in the north surprised me, one Marine would recall. I mean, the pretty weak opposition and few casualties. We thought we were done with Okinawa and would be leaving soon, so going back into the slog down south was a shock. A much-mellowed veteran would venture in retrospect that the taunting of GIs was all bravado to mask anxiety. Instead of the fantasy of going home for Christmas, they were going in to take over for the 27th. Another would remember that resentment of the Army really took root only after the Marines arrived in the south and began getting the crap kicked out of them. For it wasn't merely more combat they were returning to, but hardship that surpassed almost all they'd experienced. Sugarloaf Hill. 3 main defensive lines crossed Okinawa's south. The first, anchored by Kakazu Ridge and a collection of contiguous rises including Item Pocket, had been broken, chiefly by Army units, but at a cost that had started the wrangling about Buckner's judgment. The Okinawan campaign was already longer than those for Saipan and Iwo Jima, and although its casualties were still about a quarter less than Iwo Jima's, the brass now knew the greatest bloodletting lay ahead. It was time to shorten it by breaking the back of the defence. The ventures of Paul Dunphy's platoon across the muddy Asakawa on May 9th and 10 were feelers for a general offensive the following day, General Buckner's response to demands that he get moving again. The full-scale attack on May 11th was intended to penetrate the second and best line, which guarded Shuri. It would take place across the full width of the island where the 10th Army was stalled, about 20 miles south of the landing beaches. The 7th Army Division was enjoying a brief rest after a brutal month taking the Pinnacle, and another defensive system at a group of hills near Kochi, where it unknowingly engaged Captain Kojo's battalion. Each of the other 4 divisions faced extremely formidable barriers at their places in the line. A large hill mass called Conical Hill confronted the 96th Army Division on the Pacific coast. The heights of Shuri itself awaited the 77th Army Division. On those heights' other flank, the 1st Marine Division faced one a ridge and one a draw, a giant moat that might have been created for the slaughter of anyone mad enough to enter it. The obstacles in the path of General Shepherd's and Paul Dunphy's 6th Marine Division, just down from the north, seemed comparatively less difficult. It remained on the west coast facing the East China Sea, where the Asakawa and the Asato, another river farther south, rimmed some 3 miles of relatively flat land. Most of the 6th Division began the May 11th offensive a day earlier in order to cross the Asakawa and some fairly open ground to the main fortifications. For G, George Company of the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Regiment, May 10th started in the pre-dawn darkness, at a point where the Asakawa was shallow enough to wade across. G-2-22, comprising green men and savvy veterans of earlier Pacific combat, was a typical Marine company typically convinced it was far better than typical. Its young commander, Captain Owen Stebbins, had fought on the Marshall Islands and Guam after graduating from officer candidate school. Having been wounded on Guam, he was as relieved as anyone at the ease of the company's landing on L-Day and relatively painless April in the north. Good-natured Stebbins, who'd played football for Fresno State College, seemed to take everything in stride. Admiring him for his combat experience and fairness, his men were confident that nothing ever fazed him. But after crossing the Asakawa in the morning's dense fog, he was no less amazed by the scope and skill of the Japanese preparations than Paul Dunphy had been. Their camouflage was so superb even in fairly open territory that some of my men were hit by machine gun fire from 5 yards away. And in the back because they had the terrific discipline to hold their fire until our patrols passed, or until our men came almost right up on top of them, so near they couldn't use mortars or grenades to knock out the machine guns or get back the wounded, who were just too close. When 2 of Stebbins's 3 infantry platoons were pinned down almost immediately, he was faced with one of the decisions that torment company commanders in the field. A scout cut down by a hidden Japanese machine gun lay within yards of it. Stebbins felt he couldn't attack the emplacement with grenades or mortar fire because his man might be alive. He risked using his binoculars, whose glint in the sun now rising over the Japanese position would make him a special target. From 200 yards away he saw the body wasn't moving, but still hesitated to use heavy armament until he could be sure. Now entered the element of chance that always determined life and death on the line. A medical corpsman who'd already saved several men by braving pinpointed hostile fire crawled out to rescue the scout while the machine gun still chattered. The wounded man was alive because he happened to have fallen into a crease in the ground, where further bullets whizzed over him, but now killed the corpsman. When Stebbins later had time to think beyond the demands of the field, he saw that twist of fate as yet another confirmation that combat was a constant roll of dice. The element of luck is enormous. One guy's miracle is the next guy's death. 2 long days later, Stebbins's company was again pinned down by heavy, accurate fire from a hill in its path. It had been assigned a platoon of tanks to attack with it by Lieutenant Colonel Horatio Woodhouse, the commander of the 2nd Battalion. After encountering increasing fire as they neared that hill, the 4 tanks waited some 80 yards back. Stebbins himself was in an unprotected observation post some 300 yards forward of the company's command post, where First Lieutenant Dale Bear, the executive officer or second in command, was positioned with the machine gun officer. Stebbins's 1st platoon was on his right, the 2nd on his left, and the 3rd in a reserve position, just behind the company command post. Dashing to consult with him in his observation post, 2nd Lieutenant Edward Ruiz reported that heavy fire had pinned down his platoon, the 1st, and was inflicting casualties. He hoped the tanks would help. And rising for a better look at how they should use the terrain, Stebbins was quickly hit by 3 machine gun bullets. He would recuperate for several months in a hospital and then go home, whereas the same burst that raked his little observation post, no doubt aimed at him, the officer killed his runner. By that time the single surviving rifleman in his forward observation post. His other runners had all been hit earlier. Meanwhile, Ruiz had sprinted back to his men, dodging, ducking, hitting the ground every 10 yards. Platoon leaders were the officers who stood or crawled beside or in front of their men in battle. Known as one of the best, Ruiz was virtually idolized by his men for his leadership. 2 days earlier, Stebbins had noticed a dirty bandage the lieutenant was trying to conceal. Shot through the hand the day before, shortly after crossing the Asakawa, he went without treatment in a battalion aid station because he wouldn't leave his men when things were getting difficult. Stebbins also knew Ruiz would never let his platoon stay pinned down long, which is why the captain had chosen it to lead the way onto the troublesome hill ahead. Fearless, tiger-quick Ruiz liked to fix the positions of machine guns that were pinning down his men by showing himself to draw their fire. But this hill had too many concealed machine guns firing too great a volume of fire. Trying his daring move again, Roos was killed. The body of the runner who'd been killed beside Captain Stebbins tumbled into a decline. Unable to find his walkie-talkie radio, the captain crawled toward the rear until he was spotted by one of the tanks. It radioed the company command post, and stretcher-bearers were dispatched to bring the captain farther back. While he was being bandaged, he told Lieutenant Colonel Woodhouse, who'd run back from his battalion's forward observation post, that the tanks were needed quickly. Woodhouse took First Lieutenant Bear, who replaced Stebbins as company commander, to where they could coordinate another go at the hill. Runners were sent to inform the 3 platoons to ready themselves for a tank-supported attack to be led by Bear. The obstacle had to be taken quickly, as its fire was holding up the entire advance in the area. Casualties among the lieutenants serving as platoon leaders had been especially heavy in the 2 days following the crossing of the Asakawa. Stebbins had also lost the leader of his 3rd platoon on that same advance, to mortar fire in the morning fog of May 10th. His place was taken by Platoon Sergeant Edmund DeMar, the Brooklyn boy who'd ventured a spell in Miami before enlisting in 1940. Now 25 years old, DeMar was called not Pops, like so many men over 20, but Mummy, thanks to his regular admonitions to his teenage charges during their training. "Do I always have to be a mother and father to you?" When the runner arrived with the message from Bear, Mummy was in a protected little position near the company command post, several minutes' run behind where Captain Stebbins had been hit. Despite the delay during the previous hours and the casualties to the company's 2 other platoons, the new obstacle gave no indication that it would be uglier than others in the 2-mile lake of fire since the Asakawa. The prominent hill, as the Americans referred to it, stood beyond a slight draw that formed a corridor leading up to it. A similar rise called Charlie Hill had fallen the day before to the 1st Battalion, after a day and a half of tank and infantry assault supported by naval gunfire. There was no reason to expect the new hill, barren except for a few scrubby trees, would be more difficult. DeMar, studying it again from a few hundred yards north, saw it as just another lump, a brownish incline with a little knoll on top. G Company's return to combat had been hard. After suffering only 2 battle-fatigue casualties during its weeks in the north, it lost 9 men to exceptionally heavy artillery, mortar and small arms fire in just 2 days in the south, including 5 killed on the first day alone. DeMar's 3rd platoon had escaped from one action only with the aid of a smokescreen, but the company would soon look back to those 2 days pushing south to here as almost easy going. At least everyone could still keep track of the killed and wounded. Actually, DeMar was reassigning the functions of the missing men in his weakened platoon when the runner arrived with the order to meet with Lieutenant Bear for coordination. DeMar had 28 men left of a full complement of 40. According to the plan, they would be joined by 19 men still fit for action from dead Ed Rues's 1st platoon and be supported by the tank platoon. The hill had to be taken quickly because its machine guns and mortars were badly chewing up everything in sight, including other companies. The tanks were waiting in a depression not visible from the hill. When Lieutenant Bear gave Platoon Sergeant DeMar and the replacement for Ed Roos the plan of attack, they took the usual precaution of squatting far enough apart so that one mortar round couldn't hit them all. They were eager to learn one another's names to avoid calling out Lieutenant or Sergeant, another way of making themselves priority targets for snipers. The plan was straightforward. DeMar and his men on the left, Bear and the reduced 1st platoon on the right, and the tanks moving out at the same time, while a machine gun section would give additional fire support as they advanced. The tank commander wanted assurance that he wouldn't be left high and dry. Tanks were a great advantage to the infantry they supported, and the American 10th Army had vastly more of them than the Japanese 32nd Army. But enemy fire of such intensity and accuracy turned even the best American Shermans into a danger too, as targets for concentrated salvos. Veterans learned to control their first instinct to crouch behind them for protection and to mistrust the false sense of security they provided. especially when anti-tank guns and other armament zeroed in on their whistling and clanking. The instinct of troops at their sides was to scramble as far from them as quickly as possible, leaving them vulnerable to dreaded Japanese infantrymen with satchel charges. Against powerful defences, therefore, tanks needed the protection of infantrymen as much as infantrymen needed the extra punch from tanks. Damar urged the lieutenant in command of those 4 Shermans not to worry. "We'll stick to you like flies on poop." They synchronized watches. Jump-off time would be 1600 hours on a signal from Lieutenant Baer. Damar returned to his platoon and gave the word. Final preparations were made for the attack. Waiting was a miniature pre-landing limbo, the men hoping the moment would come soon and that it never would. Damar worried about them, about the steady Japanese fire from both flanks, and about communications because his radio had been knocked out. It would be nice, he mused, to be somewhere else. At 1600 hours, the lead Sherman's hatch cover closed, and it started off with the 3rd platoon. It was only minutes to the hill. Starting the climb, Damar and the others suddenly saw it was thick with guns. Tank fire had ripped down camouflage, exposing dozens, maybe hundreds of emplacements now showing gun barrels and muzzle flashes. They didn't yet know that some of the most damaging fire pouring down on them was from other hills. Damar had no time to look at anything other than his men, some of whom were already down. The tanks were being hit just as fast by concealed, expertly placed mines and anti-tank guns. 2 were put out of action almost immediately. The crest was only a few hundred yards away. Hoping audacity would compensate for their lack of deception, the 2 platoons charged straight up and reached it, but with a much reduced complement. Baer spread his remaining dozen-odd men into shell holes, but the Japanese fire was so intense and the American already so diminished that the lieutenant, his radio communications also out, sent a man back to report that G needed help to hold the summit. Racing and dodging down, that messenger could see little movement among Damar's group, which was getting the hell beaten out of them. Nothing Damar had seen in combat, let alone in films, had prepared him for such concentration of incoming fire. It very quickly killed many of his men and left others unable to function as fire teams. Soon only a handful remained unhit, most prominently Baer. The big burly first lieutenant was a man of few words, who, like Ed Ruess, had been among the non-commissioned officers selected for officer training as the Marines' need for more officers to replace casualties grew. He presented a fine target, but also served as an inspiration to the men, as he tried to see to the wounded and rally the others. He motioned to Damar, something about one of the disabled tanks. Then he was violently spun around, and Damar saw a large chunk had been ripped from his upper leg. But powerful Baer picked up a .30 caliber light machine gun from alongside its 2 dead operators, threw a belt of ammunition over his shoulder, and, like a John Wayne character, laid out lead in the enemy's direction, one of the directions. It wasn't long before he took a second hit, this time in the arm, cradling his machine gun. The lieutenant continued covering fire so that some men could crawl to help others who'd been wounded, going up the hill until his 3rd hit, in the buttocks, sent him spinning out of sight. Damar quickly threw some grenades and started crawling toward Baer. Then he felt as if someone had taken a log from a fire and slammed it with all his might into his leg. He went down flat and couldn't get up. Still down, he saw one of his 3rd platoon men spring up and bang on a disabled tank with his rifle, after which the crew fired furiously for a moment, against what looked like thousands of Japanese coming at us, as a crew member would later put it, until they ran out of ammunition and escaped through the tank's emergency hatch. Other tank crews continued firing, although their vehicles were burning, then leaped out to help wounded riflemen. There was no place anywhere to make a stand. Much later, in the sweet luxury of being alive to remember, Damar would quip it was a situation from which General Custer would have cut and run. Dirt had jammed his rifle. He had no cover or protection. Knowing a sniper was poised somewhere on his left, maybe the one who'd already hit him, all he could do was hug the ground for all he was worth. He heard cries, from about 10 yards away he guessed, from a private named James Davis, whose size had earned him the nickname Little Bit. Strong and tough, nevertheless, Davis was only 18 years old, and his wounds were obviously very bad. He was crying for his parents to come get him. Damar grunted for him to shut up. Any noise there would probably be a fatal noise. When Davis eventually did fall silent, Damar hoped it was because he'd heard him. Disabled in the extremely precarious position on the crest, Damar thought of his own parents. He looked at his watch. It was 16:45 hours. 45 days, not minutes, seemed to have passed. Now no Americans at all seemed still to be firing, and he could see none except dead and wounded. "What am I going to do?" he asked himself, trying to stay calm. He decided to wait, head as flat on the ground as he could push it. It would soon be dark. His leg was numb and he'd lost a lot of blood, but he knew he could crawl. A figure slithering down the hill in the dark would most likely be finished off by his own troops, who would take him for a Jap, especially at night when they were the only ones to move. He didn't even have that night's password. But those were problems for later. Now he could only lie where he was, still surprised and dismayed by the dense, accurate Japanese fire from big guns, small arms, hand grenades, and mortars. Some time later he heard a whisper. "Damar, you hit bad? Can you crawl?" Although he didn't recognize the voice of the man risking his own life for his, the sense of comradeship gave him an incredible lift. "Can I crawl?" he whispered back, his head still half buried in the mud. "I can crawl back to the States." A good smoke screen was laid down, from smoke shells fired by the surviving tanks, Damar would later learn. He started down. Someone joined him from behind and cut off his pack to ease his crawling. Finding a little ditch, he squeezed into it for cover and kept crawling until his hand touched the body of a rifleman from his platoon, who had a bullet hole between the eyes. He tried to pull the body with him, but the helper behind urged him to just get down off the hill for now. Although it would have been a 4-minute stroll from summit to bottom, the incomprehensibly intense enemy fire made their progress painfully slow. Soon he came upon Lieutenant Bear, badly bleeding from his wounds but trying to get his machine gun operating. Damar tossed him his pistol because he believed he had some hand grenades left for any Japanese who might try to hurl satchel charges against the tank he hoped would take him back. Reaching it, he saw Little Bit's body lying alongside, where it had been pulled by Jim Chasson, the man who'd run to the command post for reinforcements, then run back up the murderous hill to help his buddies. A tank man quickly dressed Damar's wound, but Mommy refused to move until all known wounded had been brought down from the hill. Then he was hoisted up onto the turret, where another wounded man was soon placed beside him. Recognizing the youthful voice of the tanker who'd rescued him from the hill, Damar took out his battle dressing, leaned toward him, and asked where he'd been hit. 5 fast rounds cracked out. 4 hit the expeditionary can, 5 gallons of spare water or oil on the turret inches from Damar's head. The 5th hit his saviour behind the ear, splattering blood and brains all over Damar. Gripping the now grievously wounded boy as the tank roared off, he reached for his grenades and found he had none. His pouch had been shot off. When the tank made it back to Fox Company's command post, the young tank driver was dead. A sergeant asked how things were going. "Pretty rough on that goddamn hill," answered Mommy, not suspecting how much rougher it would become. The full strength of the defences was still beyond his imagination, or that of any American, including General Buckner. Those were the first assaults on Sugarloaf Hill, as it would be christened 2 days later, when Lieutenant Colonel Woodhouse would call it by a name he'd used for objectives during training exercises on Guadalcanal. No more were made that day, for the battalion commander, now aware that the objective was far more difficult than originally believed, withdrew G Company and called for airstrikes. Starting the next day, the sequence of attacks became so confused, with so many Americans cut off from their units, that it was impossible to keep track of who reached the summit before he fell. Besides, holes from both sides' shelling were so large that men who crouched in them couldn't see members of other units yards away. What was known for certain was that 5 of Damar's 3rd platoon were killed and 10 wounded on May 12th, a casualty rate of 50%. Other platoons lost even more men. On May 14th, G Company's 3 rifle platoons with their machine gun sections had to be consolidated into a single platoon, whose lieutenant would be killed that night. Sustained losses like this would quickly prostrate the 6th Division.